Good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us today here at the Center for New American Security. My name is Katherine Kuzminski. I am the Senior Fellow and Director of our Military Veterans and Society program, where we look at military personnel issues. We are thrilled today to be joined by the Secretary of the Air Force, Frank Kendall. Secretary Kendall has held a number of positions in the Department of Defense over the years, and I also like to claim him as an Army spouse, as a former Army officer. I like to remind people of that. So Secretary Kendall, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you. I abjectly apologize for the mistake on timing here. We had you an hour off, apparently. I got a nice rush of adrenaline to get me ready for the interview, because we got a chance for my security team to use the siren and the lights on the way here. And there are cops all over the place out there because of the Prime Minister Modi visit. So it was a really exciting ride over here. So I'm ready.
Good. We've got you prepped for the day. So we are approaching the 50th anniversary of the All-Volunteer Force on July 1st, which is when the United States military transitioned from a partially volunteer, partially conscripted force to the professionalized all-volunteer force that we see today. You actually served during the conscripted era, and you led soldiers who were both drafted and who volunteered. Can you talk a little bit about what you personally have seen over time in the way that the military has shifted, and what value you think that has brought?
Yeah, the short answer is that the military has become much more professional. It brought back a lot of memories. Think about this being half a century since we started the all-volunteer force. I graduated from West Point in 1971, and the formative experience of that part of my life was, of course, Vietnam. And I'm getting older to be the oldest person often in the room now, but it was an incredibly divided country, huge polarization about the war. And the draft was a centerpiece of that, because people were being forced to go out and dying. And I can remember people throwing chairs at TVs when they saw their draft number come up as a low number. When I got to my first unit, I went to grad school out of West Point, and I think I was in airborne school right after West Point when we heard that there was going to be an all-volunteer force. And there were a lot of questions about how I was going to work at the time. When I got to my first unit a couple of years later, there were about a half a dozen, I think, draftees still in the unit, working off the end of their period of service, which was 2 years. And none of them really wanted to come in the military, but we had people who had double electrical engineering degrees or close to it. And we had people who were out of high school or hadn't finished high school. So it was very much a mixed bag, but generally speaking, there were people who didn't want to be there and were putting up with it while they had to and couldn't wait to get out. So that was sort of, and it was an impact on morale. It was a tough time in those days for the Army anyway, because after Vietnam, the Army had a lot of repair work to do, basically. Fast forward 50 years, and we have an incredibly professional force. Very dedicated force, people who all want to be there. The retention, I think, across the services is doing pretty well right now. We're having some issues with recruiting we can talk about later. But retention's doing really well, and I think we're offering people an awful lot that's attractive to people. We're having to change over time. There are some generational shifts in priorities that young people have, the economy changes and so on. But I think that the all-volunteer force overall has been a success, and I think that we'll manage our way through the recruiting issues that we're seeing today. That they're, at least certainly for the Air Force, they're very manageable. And I'm very proud of the force that we have. I love getting out in the field. I get to do this fairly often and interact with our young people in particular, enlisted people in particular. Their commitment, their dedication, their passion for what they do, their eagerness to help and move forward, I think is really refreshing to me. It always energizes me. So I think we're going to continue to have a volunteer force. I think it's the right thing for the country. The one thing that has led to some degree is a somewhat more isolated military. I mean, the one thing the draft did was it brought people in from everywhere and gave people that shared experience. So we don't have that today. And that's a price we're paying. And one of the biggest issues we're seeing is the lack of familiarity with the military. A lot of people that are coming in because family members are in. And we're seeing increasingly that. And I think that's not so healthy, to have a more insular, isolated fraction of the population that is involved with the military. So one of the things we're trying to do in general with the Department of the Air Force, and I think DOD, is to give people more familiarization, have more interaction with communities, and educate people about what the military is and what it does and what it offers.
Yeah, because it's not just American youth who have less interaction, it's their influencers or parents, teachers, counselors, principals.
Yeah, we didn't have influencers
coaches.
when I was doing this. Yeah, that's a new thing.
That's right. So touching on that recruiting challenge that we see across all of the services right now, the Air Force has spent some time really digging into some of the root causes of those challenges and thinking through solutions. What have been the findings that your team has found?
The overall finding, the conclusion I've come to, and the service chiefs would agree with this, is that we have the tools to adjust our recruiting to meet our demands. We're relatively low budget, relatively low numbers of recruiters compared to the other services, because we haven't had to have more. So we have knobs that we can turn, if you will, that can increase our recruiting. And we're looking at it as a multi-year issue, not as a one-year temporary issue. One of the things that we did last year was we drew down our backlog. We use a lot of deferred entry people, and we had a pretty good backlog of that. So in order to stay close to our goal last year, we had to draw a lot of that down. And now we're trying to build that back up. So that may be people who won't be coming in, until they do another year of school or several more months or another semester or something. But we're putting them in the queue. So we're rebuilding our queue is one of our goals right now. We're also trying to get as close as we can to our targets this year. It looks like we're going to miss by something on the order of 10% for the active force, a little more than that for the Guard and Reserve. But we have things that we can do to manage our way through this. So we're not in any kind of a crisis mode or anything. We are doing a number of things, and Dave Alvin, General Alvin, the Vice Chief of the Staff of the Air Force, has led a team to do this and to kind of push through some of the bureaucracy that makes policy changes slow. We've got a long list of things that are where we had rules in place that really didn't make any sense. We're not lowering our standards, but we are changing rules about tattoos. We've changed how we do body mass index to be consistent with what the other services do. We are being a little more liberal on a negative test for marijuana, basically, THC, where you can come back and get another test after a certain period of time, and if you stay clean after that, you can still come in. So we're doing some things on the margin, and we're seeing very specific, increases coming out because of that. So the situation we have right now is kind of giving us an opportunity to, I think, take a look at a number of policies and adjust them where we can be more open to service from people that we weren't letting in before.
Yeah, and we do quite a bit of research here on personnel policy and thinking through, there's two levers, or there's two pieces of the Venn diagram. There's the ability to meet standards, and then there's that propensity to serve. Right. So how is the Air Force thinking about that? You already talked about getting out in communities, but thinking about presenting this as a viable option for American youth.
A great point. You mentioned influencers. This is, again, a new thing we're learning through social media, how to interact. Take advantage of the people that are influencers. Parents are still an enormously important influencer for their children. So, improving our outreach, improving our presence on social media, improving our advertising. Our budget's been relatively small compared to the other services. Although we did get a good spot at the beginning of Top Gun, if anybody knows that, the new movie.
It was a little shade.
Yeah, Carlos Del Toro in the Navy and I get to interact about that once in a while. Fighter pilots are fighter pilots and airplanes are airplanes. So, I'm going to digress a little bit in this, and because you set me down this path. Carlos and I were doing a Spirit movie for the clip for the Air Force Navy game, and I inserted a thing about. He made a comment about fighter pilots and Top Gun being about Navy, airplanes and pilots, and I said that's true, but we have a lot more airplanes than the Navy does, a lot more fighter planes. And we don't make you live on a ship for months in order to fly them. He did not appreciate that at all, but I'll get that in here just because I can. So it's good friendly rivalry there. But we're doing a number of things to reach out to people and have more effective communications. We're trying to learn how young people today receive information and respond to that. So we're trying to do things to adapt to current cultures and current needs. Young people today, I don't think these are dramatic shifts. The human characteristics don't change that much, but attitudes toward certain things do. We were plagued last year by COVID and not being able to get into schools. So we're back in schools now, and that's helping quite a bit. And the economy's, very low unemployment. So those two things are we're swimming against those right now. But as I said, I think we're going to work our way through this and get back to where we need to be. And the shortfall that we're having in the active force, at least, is not too troubling. The retention rates are really good. But propensity is an issue, and it's a national issue, and it's based on lack of familiarity with the military that we can all do something about, and some misperceptions in some cases about the risk you encounter when you come in the military.
Yeah, and we've seen that in the DoD survey data of potential candidates for military service. I think it's interesting looking at a lot of the research coming out about Gen Z and their priorities, because that is who we're recruiting right now. Those are individuals between the ages of 10 and 28, and that they have markedly different preferences than previous generations. But I think one of the most interesting findings I've seen is that they're more likely to join an organization where they can have multiple experiences over the course of a career, and then they'll stay loyal to that organization. And that sounds a lot like military service to me. It
certainly can. It fits well with multi-capable airmen, the idea that, and also allowing people to move from one Air Force career field, if you will, one Air Force specialty code into another one, if there's a demand for that. So we're trying to add to flexibility of, life in the Air Force or the Space Force. The Space Force is very small, and it's not having any recruiting issues by comparison because of its size. The people don't know about it as much, right? It isn't something that people appreciate the existence of as much as they do the traditional services, but they're not having any problems with recruiting. But one of the things they're trying to do when we're looking at the Space Force as sort of a pilot for what could be done more broadly in the Air Force, they're trying to have a very flexible full-time, part-time thing. There's a legislative proposal on the Hill, which I think is doing reasonably well this time. Last year we had a hard time with it, but we worked with the Hill to modify it to address some issues. And essentially it would allow people to serve and move between part-time and full-time much more flexibly than they can today, between the active and the Guard or Reserve. And right now there are some bureaucratic impediments to transitioning from one to the other, and certainly to coming back into active, right, although we do it fairly often. Space Force is going to try to break all those down and just make it very easy for people to have a more flexible career path and accommodate, whatever they need to do in their personal life or their, and it was one of the things I think people are looking for, younger people, more flexibility in how they manage their lives, and we're trying to accommodate that.
And it helps meet Space Force objectives as well, because you have people who are experiencing the state of the art outside, bringing those technical skills back in.
And we're also doing something where we're bringing people in with a valuable skill set and not bringing them at the bottom and making them work their way all the way up. They're coming in and getting them a commission or even listed grades that recognize and value the experience or the expertise that they have.
Yeah, and that's great. There were a number of flexibilities introduced in the FY 2019 NBAA, but I know the services have been kind of loath culturally to accept those, and so I think the Space Force is a good test ground for that.
Absolutely.
Building a new force from the ground up gives you some opportunities there. So the headlines always cover two things. One is the recruiting challenges, and the other tend to be in the quality of life bucket of issues. So that can include things like access to childcare. Access to housing has been a national issue that's particularly felt by military families who move frequently, and then certainly issues like sexual assault in the military. And the Air Force took an innovative approach with respect to sexual assault in the military and set up a pilot system at a number of installations, the Integrated Response Co-location Pilot. And that was kicked off last August. So thinking about the broader category of quality of life issues, but specifically the Air Force's approach to sexual assault and harassment, can you speak to some of the proactive initiatives that are underway in that front?
Sure. It's one of the issues that I think there's a misperception that you're going to be at risk, high risk of sexual assault if you come into the services. I don't think that the risk is that disparate, but the degree to which people are trying to address that problem is much higher than in a commercial firm in the outside world. And a number of things are being done. One of them is this pilot that you mentioned, where basically when someone's a victim, it often includes needs for lots of different kinds of support. And it can be both sexual assault and domestic abuse, which have different paths that you go through. So what we try to do is, instead of having the various organizations that provide support to victims scattered around different offices on the base, we consolidate them. So you had a one-stop chance, and people could take you from one office to another and help you work your way through all that bureaucracy. So whether it's legal assistance or a victim's advocate or help with some other aspect of your life, and because of the situation you're in, we've made it much easier for people to seek help and get it efficiently. And the results show that we get about twice as many people coming in and going through it because of that. So that's been a success. We have to look at, there's some obvious geographic limitations other places, but we're going to try to emulate that on other bases. So we're trying to learn from our experience. I'm a huge believer in using data to drive policy and to give feedback on policy. And this is an area where very quickly the data showed that this was something that was effective and that we need to do more of it.
And thinking more broadly about other quality of life issues, so access to childcare and housing, how is the Air Force thinking about and innovating there?
There's a long list of things that we're addressing there. I mean, my overall priorities as secretary are twofold. One is modernization and being competitive with our pacing challenge, China, China, China. The other is leaving the institution, the enterprise, healthier, more better than I found it. And that has to do with a lot of people things. So our previous roles would tend to be more on the technocratic side, doing a lot on the people side here. And on that list, for people who are serving, childcare comes very high on the list. Healthcare is one, mental health care in particular, but housing is one, education in general, quality of life issues associated with frequencies of moves and things like that. So they're a long list. And we're trying to get at all of those, but I would put childcare pretty high. We have some unique needs because of the duty hours that people have. And the problem we have there that's been the biggest is staffing. And it's a national problem. It's not just a military problem. But because we also have the hours that people work, and we often have people where both parents are working and in the military, and so that creates some problems for people too. We're building a few new child development centers. We got 5, I think, in the works right now. We've done a number of things to try to add to staff. We've provided financial incentives where we went further than the rest of the DOD did on this, where if you have children in child care, you get your first one is free and then a big discount after that for additional children. That's helped us with recruiting quite a bit. That's been a big benefit to people. We're doing more to get family-oriented, people that are doing child care in their home, right, daycare in their home, and getting people licensed and able to do that and making sure compensation is adequate. So child care is getting a lot of attention. But so are all those other issues. Secretary Austin has made taking care of people one of his themes of his tenure as Secretary of Defense. And we've gone through a series of initiatives to try to improve the quality of life, if you will, of our people and our dependents as well. And we're about to do another round of those. We've got a meeting with service secretaries with him, I think, coming up in the next week or so. And there have been things in the works that we'll be putting out shortly. So it's a continuing effort to improve the quality of life of our people.
You've touched on the fact that retention is strong, and we see that across the services. But the Air Force has historically had a specific challenge with retaining highly skilled individuals, namely pilots, given the demand for them in the outside market. And also what we've seen in our research is the effect of, you kind of promote out of the cockpit, and the choice is either stay in and have a desk job or go to the airlines and be able to fly, and sometimes that's driving the discussion as well. So how are you approaching those specific technical skills, retention of those technical skills that the Air Force invests a lot of money in, but that we might see leaving?
The pilot shortage is an interesting phenomenon. In the active force, we don't have a shortage of pilots to fly airplanes. We have a shortage of pilots to do staff jobs. We have a lot of staff jobs that are set aside for rated officers, right? So we're taking a look at that again and see if that's really necessary for a lot of those jobs. But we're doing things to accommodate the people who want to fly and keep flying. This has surprised me a little bit because I review all of our promotion board results. But we have a number of people that decline to either take a command or to be considered for command or to be promoted because they want to stay in a flying job. That's true in particular in some of the reserve and guard components. So we're accommodating that to the extent that we can. We can't always, but we are where we can. It's not huge numbers, but there are people like that, and we're happy to keep them. The bonus program that we have, and the Congress just added another layer to that, basically, to extend the period and increase the amount that annual bonus you would get for extending and staying in. And that's having pretty good effect. We're using that pretty effectively too.
Yeah, it is interesting to see those dynamics at play. So you touched on, there's two parts of your portfolio, and the big one really is, as it should be, the strategic China issue. And thinking about that, as a personnelist, I am constantly trying to make the argument that that is part of your readiness, that is
Absolutely.
part of your lethality. And a lot of times it gets set aside as the softer side of serving. So what is the case that you make for why personnel issues matter when it comes to lethality and readiness, and the things that big Air Force is concerned with?
Look, a short version of this is you can't expect someone to be performing at their peak in their job when they can't find child care, and when they're worried about that, or when they can't find medical care for their dependent, or when they, any other number of, personal life worries that detract. Our greatest competitive advantages are people. We look at the budgets of China, compared to the U.S., and we have much more expensive people, but we have much better people. We have much higher quality people. I am endlessly impressed when I go out to the field and I talk to people doing various jobs out there, and the depth of their knowledge, their passion for what they're doing. I mean, we give people, challenging work with a real sense of purpose on a very cohesive team. That's what we're trying to give people, and that's why our retention's so good. People love what they're doing, and they're staying there, and they're continuing to do it. So once we get people in, we don't have a problem keeping them. But we do need to continue to work on the kind of quality of life issues that we talked about and make sure that we're doing everything that we can there. There's tons of data that shows that cohesive teams with a high sense of purpose and trust in each other and high skill sets are much, much better and much more effective at solving problems and performing well, particularly under stress. And so military tends to put you under stress. And against the pacing challenges, for example, that's going to be very true. And that's not just of the people who fly airplanes, it's going to be everybody who's involved. So having the best performing teams that we can possibly have, and it's about teams, it's not about individual performance, it's really about teams. The reason we're doing so much work on multi-capable airmen is that we may be back in a combat situation sometime where we have a lot of casualties, and people have to do other people's jobs, and they have to keep working under extreme stress. So that's what we're shooting for. And all the other things that we talk about contribute to that. They give people the freedom to focus on their work, and they relieve them a lot of other sources of worry and stress, and they build an environment in which people can work together and feel valued and make a contribution to something that's important.
So also a thing we see in the news a lot, certainly as the HASC is debating the mark for next year, are things that fall under the bucket of DEI. And the Air Force has been really impressive in the way that you've gone after the data. So I'm thinking specifically of the IG reports. There were two. There was the racial disparity review and the addendum. So can you speak a bit to what the Air Force found, and then how you're using that to inform how you move ahead? I am a big believer in data. I've got a sign outside my office door that says that it's a quote from G. Edward Deming about, "In God we trust, all others must bring data." And the disparity reports, which I don't take credit for, the initial ones, they were started before I came into office. But they laid out very clearly, and so was some work from organizations like Blue Star Families that have looked at how individuals based on their identity essentially are impacted differently by things. And there are disparities. And you have to really look pretty carefully at the data sometimes to understand where they are and how they're occurring. And if you look at promotion rates, command selection, military justice, Article 15s, et cetera, you do see some significant disparities. So then you got to go say, okay, what's going on here? And it's not, at this point of where we are, the rules are pretty straightforward and okay. But it's more cultural, it's more in some of our practices when you get a couple layers down. So we're working all of those things. A lot of it's training.
and we're going to continue to monitor the data over time. We've got one other year of data in. I don't expect to see big changes in 1 year. I think we're now at a part of addressing the problems of disparity where it's going to take time and constancy of purpose, basically, and continued emphasis to make progress. But I think we are making progress and will continue to do so. And as I said earlier, coherent, strong teams, come from having everybody on the team valued and respected and feeling good about their own prospects for whatever advancement they might have on the team. That's what we want, and that's what we're shooting for. And it covers lots of different ways. Gender is one, race is another, ethnicity is another. And in some cases, it's understanding that people who come in might have a different background than other people would, who have a different identity, if you will. And we need to do some things to help that part of the human capital that we have mature faster and make up for some things that might not have occurred for them before they came into the service. So it's now hard, detailed, patient work, I think, in a way, painstaking work to move forward, but we can move forward and we will.
Yeah, I think people forget that in the military, it takes 30 years to change who's sitting at the top, and who's sitting at the top affects the entire pyramid below them. So personnel work is a long slog. And also thinking about collecting the data and tracking that over time to see how different policies affect, 10, 15 years down the line.
And you have to be careful of unintended consequences. Things don't always have the impact that you expect them to. So trying to sort out correlation and then cause and effect where you can is an important part of it all.
Yeah, for sure. So thinking about the policies that you're putting in place now, that's going to affect the Air Force of 2043, 2053, right? Your next, your Chief of Staff of the Air Force of 2050, might be commissioning in the coming years. So what does the airman or the guardian of 2043 look like, and how do we get from here to there?
Well, what I think, the short answer to your question is maybe a little glib, is that he looks like the American of 2040. We want a military that reflects our society, and inevitably it will, right? So as America changes, so will the military. And we want a broad spectrum of Americans so that we do represent society well. Our job is to protect that society, and I think we can do that much more effectively if we're seen as being, in a way, a microcosm of the society. The country's getting more diverse over time, and one of the things that I think we're seeing play out is how that journey is affecting a whole bunch of things in the military and out of it. I think that's actually a healthy thing for the country, and I think we'll see a military that is more able to take advantage of all the human capital that's available to it than has historically.
This is a question that's a bit in the weeds, but certainly gets a lot of conversation in the young officer op-ed community. Thinking about, so the Air Force traditionally used the below the zone promotion pathway quite regularly, and unlike the other services, it tended to be the same people who were promoted below the zone, whereas in the Army, more people are promoted below the zone, but it's spread out across individuals who it only happens once at a time. Mm-hmm. And there used to be a 24-year pull to being a general officer in the Air Force, which is a couple of years shy of what the other services are. That's changing. What are some of the opportunities that you see in kind of lengthening the period of time before you're preparing your future senior leaders? Are there opportunities that the Air Force is taking up?
What a lot of this has been things that General Brown was working before I came in, but the observation was that people were being promoted earlier, but without the experience they really needed to do the jobs, and that it wasn't seen as objective maybe as it might have been of a process, right? So the change in almost everything we do on the personnel side, and I think you'll appreciate this, we have to regard as sort of experimental, particularly initially. And then we got to go look and see, well, okay, what really happened because we did this. I had an interesting conversation about that this morning with the two service chiefs. They had different views about the results or something. But anyway, to get back to this, what I think we're getting as a summary of this is that we're getting the same people to be generals that we would have anyway, but they're better prepared. And so they've had better experiences, they've had a chance to go out and do some things, General Brown's a good example. He did some things that were very much out of the mainstream fighter pilot track that he was on. And I think they've served him really well and prepared him to go hopefully be chairman after he's been chief. So I think we'll have people that are better prepared to take on those roles. I think in general people see it as giving them more opportunities, and you're not basically saying to people fairly early, you're not one of the chosen few. You still have a chance, and we want to give you a chance to demonstrate what you can do before we make a decision. And so far, I think that approach is working, and you know, we'll continue to learn as we go forward. The other thing that I was going to mention that's related is I did something a few months ago that got a lot of attention. I discovered that we were masking advanced degrees for our promotions to lieutenant colonel and major. And I can go on about that for a few minutes if you want, but there was an interesting artifact of unintended consequence and how people were trying to address it, so I'll spend a minute on it if you don't mind. What had happened was the way the Air Force was doing its officer performance reports had made it very difficult for boards to decide who to promote and who not to. And even for those grades, they're not automatic promotions. There are some fraction of people who don't get promoted into those grades. So what they started doing was using whether you had an advanced degree or not as a go, no go. And it became a requirement to have an advanced degree. And I've noticed that when I look at officer bios that an awful lot of people have 2 or 3 master's degrees from I'm not going to name the fields, but they're not what you would call highly challenging fields to get a master's degree in, I'll just put it that way, or necessarily institutions. So all these people, and a lot of them I think were pilots, were getting advanced degrees to have an advanced degree in their file, and they deeply resented that they had to go get this degree that they didn't think had a lot of value, but they needed to get promoted. So the solution to that problem was, well, just won't let anybody know you have a degree for anybody. So I could have a PhD from MIT in artificial intelligence, and this promotion board doesn't get to see that. Right. So I said, this is crazy. And when I looked at it, I noticed that the paragraph saying, oh, by the way, we're going to mask your degrees, was right after the paragraph I had put in about how important science, technology, engineering, and math were. And I said, this is totally incongruous, and so we got to change this. So I did. And I got a lot of resistance to the change. Yeah. We've done 2 or 3 boards with the change now, and it's not materially affecting the result. But I think we should encourage people to get advanced degrees. We should encourage them to get degrees in fields that we care about and value. And what we're doing now is we're communicating to the force for whatever career field you're in, these are the sorts of degrees we would value in that field. And so anyway, it's an iterative process is the point I'm making, and it keeps moving forward, and we'll continue to do that. We changed the evaluation reports, we changed that. We're trying to do, I like personally, and we're starting to go in this direction, forcing raters to have a distribution. Yeah. The Army's been doing this forever, and I think it works quite well, because the tendency is to say nice things about everybody, which means the boards don't have anything to distinguish from.
Right. And to getting at the unintended consequences of bringing the graduate degrees back, that's also board guidance. You can say, use your best judgment. It is not a requirement.
I was told the other day that a lot of young officers are now feeling like they got to go get a degree. They don't. We promote a lot of people without a degree, but if you have to happen to have a degree in something we really value, that should be an added a positive on your record.
So each of the services is moving to different degrees from what the field calls the industrial era model to a talent management model. I know every senior uniformed officer hates the term industrial model when we talk about the old model, but we have seen quite a bit of initiatives on managing talent and managing the individual and collecting better data. So A, can you talk a bit about what the Air Force is doing? And B, usually when we talk about talent management, we're very focused on the officer corps, which is a very small component of the overall force. So are there any initiatives underway in managing the enlisted talent?
Absolutely. The Air Force, each service is different in different ways. And my experience in uniform was in the Army. And it was in the Army of a long time ago. I stayed in the reserves until they forced me out when I got too old. But one of the significant cultural differences I'm observing in the Air Force between it and I think it's probably true of the Navy as well, is that the enlisted officer divide, if you will, is much more blurred. That enlisted people have very high capability. They're doing very technically sophisticated work. And they're, the first thing that happened after I was nominated for the Air Force job was I got a call from a former Undersecretary of the Air Force. And what she said to me when I picked up the phone was, "Welcome to the Air Force family." And I didn't realize what that really meant until I had spent some time in the Air Force. It's much more like a family. It has that attitude, and the enlisted people are members of the family. They're not, there's not the same distinction or relationships, if you will, as there are in some of the other services. That's neither good nor bad. I think that's just an artifact of the way the Air Force is structured and what enlisted people do in the Air Force. So anyway, we're very conscious of and try to manage very aggressively the career progression for enlisted people. And we try to give them a lot of opportunities for advancement. I did an Air Force Institute of Technology graduation last year, and a number of the graduates of the school getting advanced degrees, postgraduate degrees, were enlisted people. And so that was a little bit of a surprise to me, but they do things that those degrees are valuable. We have a fairly significant capacity to move, and some people on my staff have done this, to move from enlisted over to the officer ranks and get commissioned, particularly in certain specialties where their experience as enlisted people has a lot of value. So it's something we're actively working. We have a collection of things. Chief Bass, the chief enlisted person for the Air Force, very involved in this. But understanding the value that those people have to the institution, and then giving them opportunities to grow and mature as much as possible. I think this is a big part of our retention, frankly. When you're working for an institution that demonstrates that it cares about you that way, and that it's going to help you become a more capable person and give you opportunities to grow, I think that pays huge dividends in retention.
Yeah. So you are in a unique seat in that you are the secretary of a department that just is now standing up a second service. So two questions along those lines. A, when, being in the position to establish a new service and think about those norms that you're setting and policies from the get-go, what is that like? And how are you thinking about managing the equities between the two services when you're thinking about recruiting and retention?
There isn't an equity issue that I'm worried about particularly. Again, the Space Force is very small. It's right now it's less than 10,000 people, and the active Air Force is 330,000. One thing I do have to we are very conscious of. Chief Brown and I have been very aligned on this. So is everybody else, including General Saltzman, is that the Space Force is very dependent upon the Air Force. And we've got to fulfill those expectations and give them high quality support. And the Secretariat is involved obviously with both services, but the Air Staff has responsibilities for things like base operating support. The Space Force bases, they have 5 bases. The Space Force's bases are operated by the Air Force. They don't have their own security people. They don't have their own administrative people. A lot of their personnel services come through the other side, through the Air Force side. So we want to make sure that they never feel that they're being neglected or treated as second-class citizens. So that's something we have to pay attention to continuously, and always will. It's very easy for just group dynamics, right? For one group to think that another group isn't taking care of it very well. We see this with joint basing, for example. So in any event, making sure that the Space Force has the support it needs to be successful is an important part of both the Air Force's mission and my mission from the Secretariat perspective. My first meeting every single day is my Undersecretary and the 2 service chiefs and myself. We sit down every single day at the first start of the day, 7:30, for half an hour, and we talk about whatever is on the table. Whatever is coming up, any issues anybody has with anything and it's a great way to build a team and to make sure that all the current issues are being addressed by that collective senior leadership team. And that's working really well, I think, and all of the chiefs have commented that they think that's one of the most valuable meetings that they have. So it takes attention. And particularly because of the small size of the Space Force and its dependency on the Air Force, it always will. The Space Force is interesting because it has this incredibly nationally significant mission, and with a very small number of people. And space is becoming an increasingly important part of our military set of capabilities. I refer to it as it provides services to the rest of the Joint Force. It's the enabler for the Joint Force. And increasingly, we're going to go to space for communications, or we're going to go to space for things like surveillance and reconnaissance and targeting that are coming from space, and that with which all the other services cannot succeed. Mm-hmm. So the importance of space, I know, is, you asked about 2040, it's going to grow. And I think people see that now, and I think we're getting a lot of support from the Department of the Navy, Department of the Army, because people understand what the Space Force is doing for them and will continue to do for them. It's also protecting the Joint Force. The driving threats, Pacing Challenge, China and Russia, are fielding a suite of anti-space, counter-space capabilities that threaten the Space Force assets and threaten those services. And they're also using space operationally to target our forces. And the Space Force is going to protect the Joint Force from those threats. So hugely important mission. It's the high ground, if you will, in any future conflict, particularly with a peer competitor. And the whole Joint Force is completely dependent for its success on the Space Force. So that small group of 10 or 15,000 people has an enormously important mission. And I think they appreciate that. And the rest of us need to make sure we, within the national security apparatus, need to make sure that we express that appreciation.
All right, so we'd like to open it up to our audience for questions. For those of you online, you're able to submit your question online, but make sure, whether you're in the room or online, to note your name and where you're from. So I'll go to the room first. Any questions? We'll have a mic coming up here.
Chris Gordon, Air and Space Forces Magazine. Sir, you noted misperceptions the general public may have about the military. Unfortunately, perhaps some assumptions people have about the military come from a political sphere. So how does the Department of the Air Force counter that and explain what the service is like, counter those misperceptions without wading into the political muck and sort of making the situation worse?
Yeah, we basically emphasize the positives, and they're great positives. I talked about some of them earlier. Incredibly important mission for the country, challenging and exciting and cutting-edge technologies you can work on, great teams you can work on, a culture that's very supportive, and reasonable compensation for what you do, and people that work really hard to give you a very positive experience and chance for growth, so that you can continue to serve after you've come in and tried it for a few years, or you can go do something else and you use those years you've been in to advance your life and move forward, right? There are, both on the left and the right, there are some criticisms and some issues that get brought up a lot, and I think overemphasized. We talked about sexual assault earlier, and we talked about diversity too, right? The positive story there is that we're working very hard to address sexual assault, sexual harassment. We've recently criminalized sexual harassment, specifically in the UCMJ. We're setting up the new prosecutorial chain to try to get at that. And we're doing a lot, as we mentioned earlier, about when there are victims, giving them the assistance that they need and deserve. On the diversity side, the military is essentially a conservative organization. And it has always been, and I think always will be. But it's a diverse force, and getting more so over time. And we want it to be as effective and capable as it can be. And that means that people are going to have to work with people that they haven't had a chance to be exposed to or understand in the past. They're going to need to understand those people, have some empathy for them, understand what they've been through in their lives, and be able to make them as effective as they can be, and work with them well on a team. So those are all reasons that we do some of the things we do. At the end of the day, I'd made the two, China, and improve the enterprise. Improving the enterprise is about doing the mission better, and all the things we do to making it a safer place to work, and to make it a place where teams, everybody on the team is respected and is working to their full potential is all about our ability to do our job at the end of the day. And that's what we're about. So that's the response.
Anyone else in the room?
Good morning, I'm Daniel Ginsberg from the RAND Corporation and former Assistant Secretary of the Air Force for Manpower Reserve Affairs. Nice to see you again, Mr. Secretary. I have a question about Guard and Reserve relationships and how well you're using, that relationship to manage talent. Desire for continuum of service has been a priority for well over a decade now, and I appreciate your perspective on how that relationship is going and how well that's contributing to the flexibilities that you're seeking.
I think it's going very, very well. There are some points of friction, as you know very well, right? All the components bring a lot to the table and are important members of the overall Air and Space Force teams, right? We're having a big issue with Space Guard right now, which hopefully the Congress will figure out a way to get that off the table for us. But I've grown to appreciate more the Guard in particular. I was a reservist in the Army for about 20 years. So I understood, at least on the Army side, how the reserve worked. I didn't understand the Guard as well, and I've been on a kind of a learning journey with that. Both the reserve components and the Guard components offer an awful lot and are a very important part of the force. And the thing that I didn't appreciate enough was that those not full-time components necessarily are a much bigger part and a more ready part of the overall Department of the Air Force and the Air Force set of capabilities than I had appreciated before I took this job. So we're trying to ensure that as we modernize, we take that into account, and that as we create new units like cyber units and some of the units that are going to use, be doing ISR basically, so reconnaissance, surveillance, intelligence, that we get the capabilities we need for the Air Force that we're trying to build for 2040, right? And that's going to mean some change has to occur. We're trying to remove some of our oldest systems. A-10 is a good example of that, and a lot of those are in the Guard. But we're trying to ensure that we replace those with a flying mission where we can, and a mission that we really need and value where we can't. So we're doing a number of things to try to move the overall enterprise forward by how we selectively modernize and structure the different components over time. So that's kind of a work in progress. I'm trying to be very strategic about that. One of the bane of my existence, quite frankly, because of the politics of it, is basing decisions. And I'm not going to talk about Space Command today. People have a very strong sense of identity in these units, and they really value what they do and the contribution they make, and there's resistance to change. But we need to change. One of my aphorisms is, change is hard, losing is unacceptable. We are in danger, quite frankly, of losing. China is modernizing for the purpose of defeating American power projection, and they've been working on it for a long time. So we have to make changes. And so far I've been reasonably comfortable with my ability to work with the Guard and the Reserve to move forward. But there is some friction, there is some resistance to change. But the main thing that I've come to appreciate is how much they do contribute and how valuable they are. It's a very cost-effective part of the force structure. You do need to have the balance between active and reserve and Guard, because the active components basically are the feeder for, as you know well, for the other components. So you've got to keep that balance at a reasonable place. But for cost effectiveness, the Guard and the reserves both service incredibly well.
I've also been struck by, there was the 2014 Commission on the Future of the Air Force, and that it was very intentional to rest some capabilities in the Guard, in the Reserve, and to drive the health of the total force, as well as to keep that capability fresh. The Army had a similar commission, and I think hasn't necessarily seen the success that the Air Force has seen in that total force structure. And certainly the Navy is about to kick off their own commission thinking about that. So it's good to see how the Air Force is thinking about each component of the total force.
We integrate Guard and Reserve in everything we do. They're very much a part of the headquarters, and we just had our semi-annual Corona meeting where they were leadership in Guard and Reserve. We're very much a part of that. So.
Yeah. Carrie?
Good morning. Thank you so much. My name is Carrie Lee. I'm from the Army War College. My question is, you mentioned...
I'm a graduate of the Army War College.
Are you really? What year?
1998, I think.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah.
I think our longest serving faculty member actually just departed. She would have come in the year after you graduated.
Oh, oh my God.
So
Humble pie.
So you mentioned that much of the data on propensity to serve has to do with familiarity with the military and kind of Americans' declining interactions with the military across the United States. The Army is taking a kind of individualized approach to this, encouraging senior officers and folks to get out into communities, tell their stories and whatnot. I wonder, is the Air Force is there an institutional, how is the Air Force approaching this issue, trying to get out back into communities and increase familiarity? Is it an individualized approach, an institutional approach? How are you guys thinking about it?
We're doing some of the same things. We're basically asking all of our leaders at the installation level, basically, to get out and interact with their local communities. We have an institution that I think the Army also has, although I've gotten to know the Air Forces really well, and it's called Civic Leaders, where we have a number of people from the communities around our bases who volunteer to spend time with us, want to support the military, and can be sort of ambassadors for us in the communities, as well as work with us on any local issues, right? So that civic leader community is another part of, we're using them to kind of get out and give people a chance to learn more about us. But a lot of it is going to be grassroots and through, our installations are where they are, right? So those communities are where they are. And we actually have too many of them right now, but that and effective advertising. I mentioned social media earlier, using that more effectively, trying to get involved with influencers. I spent some time last year at a NASCAR race with a driver that we sponsor, who's one of those people basically, right? And that's effective for certain communities who are into that sport. So we're looking for creative ways to do it. It's getting a lot of positive active attention. We need to tell our story, and nobody can tell it more effectively than people serving when they're out there interacting with their peers in many cases, right? So it's an ongoing effort, but it's kind of an all hands on deck moment to try to address this lack of familiarity.
We conducted a needs assessment of military and veteran families in San Antonio last year, Joint Base San Antonio, and I was really impressed in the relationship between the mayor of San Antonio and the base commanders there.
Yep.
Across the Air Force. It seemed like there was a healthy
I was there recently, had a dinner with civic leaders that I talked about, and they're a great group. They're doing lots of support us there.
So I'll give an audience question from our online audience as our final question here. So thinking about the impact of AI, a lot of times the discussion is, AI replacing humans, when in reality I think it's much more humans learning how to work well with the AI and advanced decision making and whatnot. So how are you balancing those pieces?
AI is, we could spend the hour on this. I don't like the terminology because it's used so broadly, and everybody has their own idea of what it is, right? And a lot of people default to the substitute for human thing, right? That's a long way away, if ever. But there are certain forms of AI which are advancing dramatically, and the one that's getting an awful lot of attention right now is generative AI, ChatGPT, for example, DALL-E, the programs that can appear to be creative, right? I find limited utility in that type of AI for the military so far. I'm looking, and we're all looking, right? But having it write documents for you, which is what ChatGPT does, ChatGPT is not reliable in terms of the truthfulness of what it produces. There's a story that my wife and I are both lawyers, and she pointed out to me about a lawyer who used ChatGPT to write a legal brief, and it wrote a very nice sounding legal brief, and the lawyer gave it to a judge on a case, and the judge called him back and said, "I can't find any of these cases you're citing. ChatGPT just made up cases." And the lawyer's response is, "Well, I asked ChatGPT if they were real cases, and ChatGPT said yes, so I assume they were." I said, wow. We got a ways to go yet before we can rely on tools like that to do operation orders, for example. So we are giving people access to those tools and letting them play with them and see if they can help in their day-to-day work. And there are cases where you can get nice sounding prose that is about what you want it to be about. And then you have to, as a human, go in and figure out, is it truthful? And is it really addressing the thing I'm trying to address? So there is potential there for assistance, if you will, with some of the tasks that we do. But from the military operations perspective, pattern recognition, targeting, sorting through a lot of intel functions, right? Where neural networks and machine learning can be very, and pattern recognition are technologies that can be very, very helpful to you. And the thing that people don't, I think, really appreciate enough is that those technologies are happening whether you ask for them or not. I was in industry for several years while I was out of government, and I was consulting on technology, basically, with some of the major firms, and going to meetings where people just out of graduate school who were skilled in and learned machine learning techniques and so on, were putting that to work and building products to give them a competitive advantage. It's happening, and all those things are coming into our product because they're going to make them more efficient, more capable. We've got Secretary Hicks just wrote a piece about this. We've got to make sure that we apply those technologies in an ethical way and responsible way. And we need to, and she is urging others, including our Pacing Challenge, to do the same. I am concerned that our higher value system will constrain us, and that will be in some ways a disadvantage. I think in some ways it's a big advantage, but in some ways, operationally at least, it could be a disadvantage. You tolerate more civilian casualties with your AI algorithms figuring out your targeting, for example. So all of those things are going to be coming in. They're going to be used. They're going to give us more capability. Humans are still going to have the role and be responsible for what actions are taken, and they have to be in the decision-making process so they can do that in a way which is also operationally efficient, right? And we're going to have to do some work on figuring out how to test and have reliable performance from these technologies. I've asked my scientific advisory board to do two things related to AI. One was to take a look at the generative AI technologies like ChatGPT and think about the military applications of them, put a small team together to do that fairly quickly, but also to put together a more permanent AI-focused group that will look at the collection of AI technologies, quote unquote, and help us understand them and figure out how to bring them in as quickly as possible. We bring things into products through requirements. And we have to be very smart about how we write requirements so that we provide the opportunity for those technologies to get on board, and then find paths for them that address all the issues I just talked about, but get them in the hands of warfighters, where they can give them an advantage.
And train the warfighter on how to use it most
And train the
effectively as
warfighter on how to use them and what you can, one of the more effective ways to use AI is with human interaction. It provides a feedback loop to the machine learning algorithms and helps the tools become better at whatever it is that they're doing. Let's just say they're doing targeting for you, they're doing pattern recognition. If you as a human observer, we're really good at this, can do pattern recognition very quickly and distinguish different objects and help the AI understand what's what and give it feedback so it can learn and become more effective at what it does. And a lot of that, that's technology that we've been working on for quite a long time. What AI, what we're calling AI offers now is much higher processing speeds and much more data that can be handled. So it's more of an incremental advance in technology than people acknowledge many times, but it has revolutionary potential in terms of the capability that it provides. Sorry, I could go on. I could go on for a long time about AI.
We have around the office.
I've been following it for the last, for my whole career, actually, in some form.
Well, wonderful. Well, I think that's a positive note to end on here. Secretary Kendall, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
And we're thrilled to have you.
I apologize again for the lateness. Hopefully we made up for a little bit.